Welcome, everyone. Oh, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lydia Malamed-Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of APAD, the Association of International Photography Art Dealers, and welcome to our flagship event, the Photography Show, celebrating its 45th edition. Today, I'm stepping out of that role and into a new one of moderator for this panel. I'm really proud to welcome you to the Park Avenue Armory, and especially to the famous Tiffany Room, a space commissioned by the New York National Guard's 7th Regiment, which was the first militia to respond to President Lincoln's call for volunteers in 1861. Designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany, Stanford White, and Candace Wheeler, and completed in 1881, 145 years ago. For today's panel, featuring 3 exemplary female scholars discussing photography's vital role in understanding and navigating 250 years since the founding of the United States of America, it seems a fitting space to occupy proudly. I'll now introduce our 3 panelists, and then the discussion will begin. On the far end of the sofa is Jami Powell, the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs and the Curator of Indigenous Art at the Hood Museum of Art, Dartmouth College. Yes.
I paid my kids to do
that. Good. Exactly. Now I've lost. Where she also serves as Senior Lecturer in the Native American Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Studies Department. Powell is a citizen of the Osage Nation and has a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. During her tenure at the Hood Museum, Jami has curated exhibitions including Form and Relation, Contemporary Native American Ceramics, C.I. Pedix Dartmouth with Kali Spitzer and Will Wilson, and This Land, American Engagement with the Natural World, among others. She co-edited the volume entitled Re-envisioning American Art, Transforming Museum Practice, which was published by the University of Washington Press in 2025. She's on the board of directors for the Native American Art Studies Association, and most recently, she curated Cara Romero, the first solo exhibition of the photographer and artist Cara Romero, which was accompanied by the catalog co-published by Radius Books and the Hood Museum of Art. The exhibition is currently on a national tour, on view at the Phoenix Museum of Art through June 2026. Next to her is Stephanie Tung, the Byrne Family Curator of Photography at the Peabody Essex Museum, where she leads the interpretation and presentation of the museum's growing photography collection, spanning works from the 19th century to today. She has written numerous books and articles on the global history of photography and curated exhibitions such as Yon Du, Building Dreams, and the award-winning Power and Perspective, Early Photography in China at PEM. Most recently, she served as guest editor of Aperture's summer 2023 issue, Being and Becoming, Asian in America. Makeda Best, closest to me, is the Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Oakland Museum of California. She joined OMCA after serving as Harvard University Art Museum's Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography. Prior to Harvard, she served as the Assistant Professor in Visual Studies Department at the California College of Arts and previously worked at SF MoMA. As a curator, Best is recognized for her work in elevating the voices of marginalized artists. Her exhibitions at Harvard include Crossing Lines, Constricting Home, Displacement and Belonging in Contemporary Art, Winslow Homer Eyewitness, Time is Now, Photography and Social Change in James Baldwin's America, and 2021's Devour the Land, War and American Landscape Photography since 1970. She is also the author of Elevate the Masses, Alexander Gardner, and Photography and Democracy in 19th Century America, and her exhibition catalog for Devour the Land was awarded the Photography Catalog of the Year Award at the 2022 Perry Photo Aperture Photo Book Awards. She's also one of the co-founders and co-leaders of Museums Moving Forward, a staff-driven initiative to support greater equity and accountability in art museum workplaces through data and research. I want to personally thank the 3 of you for joining us today for this important discussion. After those introductions, all 3 of them will now share images that responds to a prompt, and then we will discuss them. The prompt was, identify and share a photograph, or 2 or 3, that you have come across personally, in your research or curatorial practice that has changed your understanding of conventional American history, or a photograph that you have used to challenge and reimagine the narratives and perceptions of that history. We'll begin with Jami.
Great, thank you. Before we get started, if you have an empty seat next to you, would you raise your hand? Folks who are looking for seats, go sit next to these people. There's more seats. So thank you for having us and this 250th year of our nation. It's definitely a time where I think a lot of us are questioning what that means and what it looks like moving forward. And I think for many of us, and I think those of us on this panel, have long questioned like what those histories look like and what stories have been told and what stories haven't. And I thought about what images to use and to kind of set up the conversation to share this image of Cara Romero's titled TV Indians. But I feel like everyone has seen work by Edward Curtis, Timothy O'Sullivan, and other early American photographers whose images really defined our understanding of the West, both as a place and the people who inhabited the West for a long time, and still really kind of shape those perspectives. One thing I like to have my students do, in addition to my role, as you mentioned, I teach in the Native and Indigenous Studies department at Dartmouth College. And one of the things I like to have my students do is to plug different terms into Google image search to see what images show up. And they've done some work on the algorithm lately, but if you type in Native American or American Indian, there's always Edward Curtis in the beginning. And that history is fraught, and I often use the term entanglement to describe, colonial entanglement to describe the complexities of that legacy and the way that communities today kind of still live with that. Because for many of us, those are the pictures we have of our ancestors. And so we hold them dear, but also have this uncomfortable relationship with how they've moved in the world and how they've been used to kind of freeze our communities and our cultures in a singular moment. And so, moving to this image here that Romero created in 2017, this was taken in the New Mexico landscape and features 5 Pueblo individuals that are sitting on this pyramid constructed of televisions and radios. And Cara, within her work, really does a lot of work in camera. And so she set this scene up. And she actually took all of these TVs, she had a generator, powered the TVs on, and then created this image, made it sepia toned in Photoshop, and digitally kind of added in the images on the screens. And this is easier than when I teach Dartmouth students. Does anyone want to call out an image that they recognize on the television screen? Can you see? Billy Jack. The Dartmouth, that's too old of a reference for my students. Thank you, sir. Yeah, Billy Jack, we love him, but it was also kind of a weird show. He was always barefoot. It was a lot. There's also Little Big Man. There's reference, my favorite is Iron Eyes Cody. Many of you may know him from the California public service campaign against littering, where he kind of walks, is in his canoe, pulls up, and he walks up the hill, which is actually an overpass, and he looks over and sees the highway and the refinery in the background with the smokestack, and someone throws fast food garbage out the window, and he's got one tear rolling down his face. And littering makes Indians sad. Don't do it. So does taking our land, but yeah, let's focus on littering. But the fun part about that, does anybody know where Ironized Cody is from? Maybe, I don't. He's Sicilian, not actually Native American, and so it's part of this long history of non-Native folks engaging in a practice of red face or playing Indian. That is deeply a part of American history too. Even recently, or a couple of elections ago, there was a lot of controversy around Elizabeth Warren, saying that she had Cherokee ancestry. Lots of people have these stories in their families, and for me, I think it's really about this desire to kind of assuage guilt, where if you have that legacy in your own family, then you're not a part of the problem. You're a part of the people who were victimized by settler colonialism. And so, those are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in asking. And so my students love, I sometimes show the PSA. There's also references to things like Alcatraz and nuclear testing, something that often happened within the boundaries of reservations or on federal lands that are within close proximity to Native communities. And so kind of within this single image, Kara's placing all of these, narratives that help construct this history and us piece together. But she's also placed these young people in their regalia kind of between us and the screens. And so here she's asking us to reckon with, the actual existence of these people. There's a baby in the picture as well, so thinking about kind of the future and what kind of future we're building. One of the things that, I really appreciate about Kara's work, and, this is a kind of thing that can be expanded to many Native and other photographers working today, is they're really kind of drawing on these boundaries of expectation and pushing against those expectations in different ways. And so for many of us, we're used to seeing Native Americans in feathered bonnets and buckskin with lots of beadwork. But the reality is there's, over 570 individual tribal nations that have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, and over 100 nations that aren't recognized. And each of those communities has, their own cultural practices and social organizations and structures and histories that are unique. And so there's this flattening of experience that happens. And so Kara's kind of referencing all of that and also asking us to reckon with people and images and the place that they're standing in this one photograph. So that's why I only have one to share. I didn't pick multiple, but I cheated because there's like 20. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it on to Stephanie, and
Sure.
happy to chat more.
Thank you. That was amazing. Okay, let's see if I can do this.
I should also say that Kara is here with us today, so thank you for your work and for enabling those of us who are lucky enough to have it at our institutions to teach with it and to share it with our publics.
Thank you. That was amazing. I chose two images, and so for my first one, I'm going to say a little bit about Reagan Louis's work. Reagan Louis made this photograph in 1979 in San Francisco's Chinatown, and I chose it because it really challenged my ideas of what American vernacular color photography in the 1970s was. This was something where I think ideas, the vernacular is like as a word is really about finding a common language of the ordinary people. And you think immediately of Shore, Eggleston, Meyerowitz. Reagan was also part of that, but in a very different way. And he found something that was, himself is a fourth generation Chinese American, grew up in Bay Area. It was a student of Walker Evans and went, after studying at Yale, he went back to the Bay Area to take up a job at San Francisco Art Institute. But what he did, he took his 4x5 camera and really went to look at Chinatown. And it was really about finding all these places with a new lens and photographing them and capturing these people and their blurs. And he says that the blurs are actually his ancestors or ghosts. So it's really about this like ghost story. And I thought, like, what better way to think about divergent histories or divergent realities than tell a ghost story through a photograph. And I love in the middle of it, there's also this little boy underneath a sort of awning. And I really think that's Reagan who's trying to find the little boy and amidst all of this landscape. And so it really made me think about this notion of American vernacular. Again, vernacular is about having a common language, but like, what does that mean to have a common language? Can there be some sort of things, can we consider something like an accent or a dialect? And what is a dialect or accent, but then having some sort of historical, cultural references or history that is with you? Is it also kind of like a ghost? And so I was thinking about these as I was looking at Reagan's work, which I think is absolutely beautiful, and thinking about how these sorts of histories and cultures can sort of be within one image themselves. The other image that I brought is this one, Charles Wong's Year of the Dragon, 1952. So this is a photo essay. I first encountered it in Aperture magazine. It was in the 5th issue of Aperture. Charles Wong was a student of Minor White and Ansel Adams. He was also a student of, I think it was Cal, maybe it was the predecessor to SFAI. And so I think it was really interesting to me because in the Aperture version, there was a very melancholic version of this photo essay that's talking about, again, San Francisco Chinatown. But then this led me to find the actual dummy for this book in the collection of SF MoMA. And that expanded dummy was much, much richer. It had so much more, it had so many more emotions. It was patriotic, but it was also, there was rage, there was friendship, there was also just sort of hope. And so one of the things that he was writing here was about, this is our inherited freedom, our right to vote. This is a new day for a new human, a new tiny American. I don't know if you can read that, but that's like, I think what it's saying over there. I just double checked. And I thought it was really important to see because there's nothing of this melancholia of the vanishing Chinatown, which is, I think, a trope that you see again and again and again. But really, he's not talking about trying to assimilate. He's asserting in 1952 that this is the birthright to vote. And this is our inherited freedom. And I think at a time when birthright citizenship is under attack again, it's just really beautiful to see this work 75 years ago that was already happening. And so that's why I chose it to bring it out today.
So I chose 3 images. I feel like you ask a curator to choose images, you're going to curate a selection.
Well, I like that somehow you all chose way more.
3 images that I think about a lot and that I feel like are also in dialogue with each other. This is a photograph by Dawood Bey, 2 boys on Carrollburg Place. For me, it's not so much about what, this is probably not what Dawood was doing. But to me, the date is very important, and these 2 boys. And it reminds me, as a descendant of enslaved people, of a generational change and of a generational struggle of what does civil rights look like, what does the world look like in a kind of post-Reagan era for us. And so these 2 boys, for me, are about kind of this moment of real kind of realization of a shift that had begun to occur and a kind of realization of what our kind of generational charge is. So I think about this photograph a lot. The next photograph is another one that I also think about a lot, by Marion Post Walcott. And what I love is that when she's in Miles, Mississippi, really the kind of Mississippi is really the birthplace of the civil rights movement, the place where a lot of the most brutal responses were felt by African Americans. But she is here documenting this moment of these cotton pickers and their pay. Well, I'll talk about that in a moment, but first she's on the outside, and then eventually she moves inside, and it's just one photograph, and for me it is so startling, because if we think about those two boys and 1989 and a kind of post-Reagan era and looking forward at civil rights, and for me it is a kind of a thought piece. It's about a kind of imagining of a world and of a past. This to me is about the realities of what those boys had inherited and just how entrenched the injustice was. The detail that I always seize on is how small that window is that man has to reach his hand through. There's no need for that, but that is about debasing him, and that he's not reaching for money. He's reaching, of course, for a voucher, which he's going to use to have to shop at the store owned by the people that he works for. And you're looking into this space where he can't even see the people that he's interacting with because of the bar, the way the structure of the windows are. And you can imagine that he has no literacy, right? He probably does not have enough literacy to understand really this transaction. But he's looking into this world of power, all that paper, all those numbers, all those machines, even the clothing of these people is about power versus him and his hat, and he can barely get his hand into the window. So if the first one for me is about, again, a kind of imagining what is my charge as a descendant, this is about recognizing just how entrenched injustice is and continues to be. And the third photograph is by Chandra McCormick and Keith Calhoun, the New Orleans-based, Louisiana-based photographers who happen to be also, my family is also from this region. But as you may know, they lost their archive. They're documentarians. They lost their archive during the Hurricane Katrina. And so for me, this image further references, it goes back to those two boys, and it speaks to the compounded ways in which injustice in America is felt. So it's not only all of those, the economic injustice, it's also the effects of environmental racism and injustice that really Katrina revealed. But it is also going back to that generational story. It is also a gift, I feel like, from elders of showing us resilience and hope, that there is a way forward. So it is a message also for this generation as well.
Thank you, all three, for those incredible explanations and jumping off points for this discussion. I'm now going to read a couple of questions that actually Makeda and the panelists formulated themselves, and that will lead our discussion here. The first one we're going to begin with and I think works really well with everything we've just discussed, but how do the legacies of America's founding principles and ideals play a role in our curatorial practices, and how do we seek to connect and engage with audiences around them? Who would like to begin?
I think since I tried to write it out, maybe
Okay.
no question. I'm like, hey, that's good.
That's a great question.
I mean, I think about that in terms of our collections, and we're here at a photography fair thinking about what to add, what do we need in our collections, and I think about the kind of dialogue that is possible to build in our collections, for better or for worse, right? Whatever is in there, how do we speak back to that, and how do we speak forward? And I think that's a very exciting place to be, actually. But looking at our collections for these stories that we can pull out, and it may be some of it might feel like insider baseball, right? But I think that our job is to make those connections for visitors and viewers to those kind of stories that we're trying to tell about what we've inherited, but also what we see moving forward.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think a lot about how photography is a medium that's both and. It's something that can be used, thinking about Americans' founding principles and things, like it is a medium that it can be used for surveillance and control and also state violence and dispossession, but it also is something that is democratic for liberation, self-expression, self-determination. And so I think in terms of my curatorial practice, I also always holding those things at the same time. And when I'm trying to sort of collect things and also show things in exhibitions, I try to keep that ambiguity and toe that line to keep showing people that it's always both and. And like that's something that I think is important as we try to very polarized world to actually keep room or hold space for that sort of ambiguity and expansiveness.
Yeah, I think learning how to sit with and kind of grapple with ambiguity is a skill that we aren't teaching young people anymore, and things, you know, are, the world is not black and white, even though that is, you know, what early photography shows us. But even then it was shades of gray, right? And so I think we, you know, when thinking about kind of these founding principles, it is like, my question that I thought of, well, is it what we say we're founded on, you know, freedom of expression and these things, or is it how we got to build this place and found this place, which was through, you know, dispossession of land of Indigenous people and the dispossession of labor from enslaved Africans and their descendants. And, you know, that is not something I say to, you know, for any other reason that it's the truth of how we got to be to this place. And, you know, the need to kind of reckon with those histories and to acknowledge those histories, but to also acknowledge that we're still here, we're still creating. Even throughout all of these moments in history, there's been this incredible artistic production from marginalized communities in this nation that we are all a part of. I don't know if we can go back to the Dawood Bey image, but I love that you can read this image in so many different ways. And one of the things that I notice when I look at this image is they're babies. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they have their whole lives ahead of them. And you can go one route and think of all like what the statistics are of their lives being cut short. Mm-hmm. You know, the kind of discrimination they face, the talk that their parents and, you know, elders have had with them about how to carry themselves if they have an interaction with the police that, you know, other kids don't have to receive, right? But there's also just this innocence and hope. And, you know, you can read that direction too. And, you know, I think that's the beauty in art and our interaction with it, is that you can bring all of these different interpretations, and depending on your mood or what you've read recently, it really changes, you know, the way you look at something. And so coming back to these same images over and over again can really change the way that you look at them and find something new.
Yeah, and something you were just saying reminded me about the uniqueness of photography as a medium of seriality, right? As a medium of multiples. There's a hopeful aspect of that you keep making another image, right? There's another image out there. Mm-hmm. And that work that artists have done to try to picture something, that kind of problem solving is they're solving pictorial problems, but they're also solving problems out there, right? And there is something hopeful about that possibility that the next frame or the next time, I mean, they're making something out of nothing, right? There is nothing, right? These were just two boys standing there, and it becomes something, and that's actually beautiful, right?
Well, I'm going to go off the questions for a moment, because I think it's fascinating that of the images all three of you chose, a child or young people feature into all of them. And what does that say about kind of a panel and a discussion of looking back, but it goes into what we're always looking forward to and what some of these things might be trying to change for the better or worse. I wanted to know if either of you wanted to speak a little bit about the children that are both in yours and how you've read that kind of similarly, because it seems like all of them have these inherited pieces and the idea of the ghost and the ancestor in it. And so how is that changing the way that you use these images in your curatorial practice? Like how has that idea of ancestry or bringing in these transitional moments and generational moments?
Figured into curatorial practice?
Yeah, in trying to help move the conversation forward in changing those narratives and trying to change and exemplify what has happened between the photograph in 1931 and this one.
Well, I think
Apologies
I use this
took
one
me a while to get there.
in my show on James Baldwin, and one of the reasons why there were a lot of children in that, and one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on that was to show young people that ordinary young people were doing things, and they were involved in activism and civil rights work. I like the fact that we don't know who they are. I think that showing young people that that's possible and that people have done things what is important to me. But I also like that we've chosen images that aren't there's nothing iconic happening.
Yeah.
These are all kind of everyday images. There's a kind of mundaneness to them.
If you go back to the Charles Wong one, I think there's something, it was really beautiful, and I've told this story before, but like when he was doing the issue with Aperture, he was already 100 years old. He had no email, no cell phone, and so I got his snail mail, and I wrote to him, I was just like, we're going to do this issue, we would love to have it featured, it's like something that I think is important and that younger people should know about. Weeks later, I didn't hear anything, and then I was like, oh, he must have forgotten or never gotten it. But like one day, this letter shows up, and it's a whole thing about like, how much that meant to him, because he was not somebody, he showed for a little bit with Ansel Adams and others at the Barbara Zinn Gallery in San Francisco, but then he went back to being a steel worker. So he sort of left the art world behind. And so I think when I reached out, it meant a lot to him that somebody was looking at his work. And he and his partner, Irene Poon, they wrote back saying like, oh, this is an important project. We are with you. And I thought that was just so, it was so touching that like there was this 100-year-old photographer who was still thinking about these ideas. He was thinking completely about like elections and then also thinking about the project. And so thinking about that inheritance and then about the future and then children was something that I was like, oh, that is something to pass on, that like sort of that feeling of we're with you, that there is a lineage in its own ways.
Yeah, before the talk, we're all mothers too.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's, about 10 years, my sons are here, it's spring break. You're talking about how your kids are in New Jersey with their grandparents because
Exactly
it's
how they
spring
wanna
break.
spend it,
And,
I'm sure.
and it's not something the art world has always been welcoming to. I think it's new. There's still sometimes where I bring my kids and I think the people are like, ooh, why did you do this? It's like, because I'm a single mom and I have no other choice. But also because we need to create an art world that is welcoming to children. I got into the museum field and curatorial work because I wanted to change the narratives that I was seeing in museums. I wanted my kids and other kids to come in and feel like they were represented within these institutions, that they could see themselves not just as relics of the past or people working in service to others, but as, leaders, as people who, are contributing to this world, which is, what has always happened. And so for me, I actually talk about how becoming a mother actually made me a better researcher. I was in my dissertation trying to write about women's participation in like Osage Nation building. And when I read them the first time, before I became a mother, I was like, well, all these women are just talking about their kids. This isn't what I'm looking for. I want them to talk about sovereignty and activism. And then after I had my kids and I went back to those transcripts and went back to the archives and was reading about how they were saying, well, we started making these clothes because it was important for our kids to participate in these, in our dances. That, we were doing these things for our children, like that was these women's contribution to nation building. And I think that's, it's in photography, but it's also in other, other art forms and curatorial projects I've done recently where focused heavily on the role of mothers and children as, this like really unseen part of nation building that is core to, our future, right? There's lots of scholarship about, nation building within this like political sphere and, but there's all of these other ways that we determine, what kind of future we're building. And it's often through like, what do we want our kids to have access to? What are the things that we want our kids to carry forward with them? Those lessons, and those come both from within community, but also through the kind of messaging within schools and institutions.
When we think about, and this kind of comes, you mentioned we're at an art fair. These things, these commercial spaces are to bring people in and to welcome new audiences to photography. But one of the big kind of intimidation factors is always kind of the process of photography. Photography is a very familiar medium, but not always one that's always understood. And you've each chosen images that are using multiple different processes and different ways of documenting moments. And I'm wondering how you've investigated those processes and what maybe was accessible to different peoples and what materials might have been available for these documentations and why you chose these processes.
I think you've raised this, Stephanie, with the vernacular, that these are images that are all, mine, I feel like they are very accessible, but I feel like one of the things that I try to do is choose images where there is you're thinking about the details and you're thinking about the photographer's, selection and their work, and that work might be subtle, but it's there. And I think that that this is what makes audiences kind of engage with it. Again, a very simple photograph, but there's something about, in each of these, or this one, there's something, going back to the two boys, right? There's something about that door, right, that announces a kind of intentionality. So I think it's showing that range of choices that a photographer can make, but it's also demonstrating for the viewer and engaging them with these kinds of choices. That appear to be, this seems very natural, but there's intentionality there.
I think it's interesting because when I try to tell my daughter, who's 5, what I do, she's like, I don't understand Curator, but she's like, your job is to look at things, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's basically what my job is, to look at things and try to figure out why that thing looks the way that it looks. And that is, I think, it's like a very basic tool that I think we are teaching when we're talking about photography. And like you were saying, the trying to understand the intentionality of these images is something that I think is important, and what we're trying to do with the images that we've selected, and then also thinking more broadly about the exhibitions and the collections that we're building, thinking more about why these photographs, why the choices were made, what was the intentions behind them, and then using those things to teach people how to look and also understand that there's intentions behind these things, all the images that they're looking at.
Yeah, we all have access to, high resolution photography on, in our pockets, in our bags. through our phones. And, I think young people, like, I'm sure your kids are, what, 5 and 2? Does your 2-year-old try to take pictures on your phone?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
like the so the, like, photography as something that is part of our daily lives is really ubiquitous in a way that it wasn't when we were kids. But there's also this interesting shift happening where, young people are becoming really interested in more analog forms, right? And so I think, going back to Kara's image, Kara was trained in black and white photography, working in a darkroom, and then later went and studied digital photography, and has been working on, kind of blending those two skill sets to create these otherworldly images where you're kind of like, I'm not sure what it was, what's going on here. And it's, I think a lot of people wrongly assume that a lot of it is done, through Photoshop or photo illustration. But, so much of it is in camera because that was the way that she was trained. But now, like, I'm really interested to see how, younger photographers who are trained in, digital photography, who are, later in their lives, maybe not until they're in college or even MFA programs, approaching the darkroom as, a place where they can see themselves making work. And, I think it's the blending of those, different techniques that leads to really interesting work. But also, just thinking about the accessibility of photography too, that, because we all, have access to these images, and like you can use different filters and play with the aperture on, or the brightness and different things, just on the screen. It's become so easy, but like it's rooted in the analog practice, the same way that I often take students we have like a book arts workshop at Dartmouth, and they will do letterpress printing, and there's leading and things, and they're like, oh, is that why when I, am doing graphic design, it's called leading, the space between the words? I'm like, yeah, it comes from this process. And they're like, oh, I had no idea. And so like the same thing is happening in photography of, that kind of like backwards learning.
Well, there's a kind of passivity of current processes, right? And I think that there can be, but I think that the possibility in studying, images is to activate those choices in the world in which photographers are in which they are very active. I think there's a misperception that this work is passive and you just kind of dial in things or you turn it black and white, right? And so how do we, encourage a kind of understanding of the activeness, the active nature of this work, which if we are going to have another 250 years, right, we do need to kind of actively engage with the world, right, versus this kind of passiveness.
And the observational factor instead of being an active participant in it. And I, it goes back to the image that you picked, that, that's an active decision to be in that room shooting out and trying to document that, and that this is, I'm sorry, my mastery of the clicker is not what it should be, but what that choice was, from going from the outside to the in and making sure that that moment is documented. And that's the power that photographers have in those choices and in the processes that they're choosing to make.
And the movement of their body, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is, again, an active engagement with the world, and it is a way of thinking, and we can learn from that as lay people, as non-photographers, that kind of movement, that kind of putting your body into space, and that kind of choices around what you're looking at, what you're seeing, how you're framing it, how you're interpreting it. Those are things that we can learn from.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to ask, I'm going to go with one more question, then we'll open it up to Q&A. The last one is, and I think this is particularly interesting for the three of you on the couch because you do work in different disciplines and across medium and across specialties for that. But what are, where do we see potential for generative collaboration in understanding and better navigating these histories through the collections and your practices? Jami, do you want to start this one so we don't keep going?
Yeah, so, I think for me, it's really about, as a curator, stepping back and letting the artists engage audiences in difficult conversations. I've been asking a lot of questions in my labels, trying to, engage audience in a dialogue about what do you see in this image? What, how does this relate to your own experience? I think, the long gone, or not long gone, but hopefully gone soon, are the days of this kind of authoritative curatorial voice where we know all of the things that there is to know, and we are just sharing what you should think of an image or an object with the folks who are coming in. And really kind of asking them to be in dialogue with the works on view. And I also think that it's, I got into this work, like I said, because I didn't feel comfortable going into museums growing up, and I wanted to make young people from my community and from other marginalized communities feel like they could inhabit these spaces and see themselves in these spaces. But it's not about this kind of reversing of the status quo and making folks who have always been comfortable in these spaces feel uncomfortable. It's about engaging in a dialogue about how we got to be here, where we want to go. And that's really a conversation that we have to be having together. And so in order to do that work, we can't simply, kind of speak from our own perspective, but rather present, multiple possibilities. And, that's what artists are great at. That's why I went the curatorial route instead of the tenure track route in teaching and publishing peer-reviewed scholarship, because I really appreciate the intellectual generosity of artists and their willingness to open up their work to dialogue in a way that academics aren't. And so kind of drawing on that intellectual generosity and opportunities for engagement is, I think, what is necessary. Okay. But it is hard. It is really hard.
I think, yeah. I think a little more community, artist voices, I think is really important in exhibitions. I think also just more collaborations and interdisciplinarity. Photo is often photo, and you have the photo galleries. But I think actually having things talk to each other is really interesting. And one of the things that I was thinking about was actually, I was really inspired by, at PEM, institution I'm at, we have this gallery on this ground, Being and Belonging. And I know that you were also familiar with the development process. It's a gallery of American art and Native American art together. And it's a beautiful gallery in that there's 50% for each of the sort of departments, but it sort of comes together and it goes apart again, and it comes together and goes apart again. And it creates this beautiful double helix of effect, which is no better. I was like, oh, that makes total sense if you're thinking about the DNA of American art. You have to have both. And I love that as a way of thinking of that spaces, just generatively, just being able to have these different sort of disciplines touch and then come apart and touch and come apart and make those conversations rather than having silos of this photography here and this painting here and then not talking to each other. So I think in some ways, for me, I think that notion of collaboration is the future.
So I'll take another kind of approach to the collaboration and think about, one of the reasons why I showed the McCormick and Calhoun image is because I think about the archives, and I think about the opportunity in the archives, contemporary archives, stories that are out there that continue to show the ways in which everyday Americans have continued to engage with this idea of America. How they responded to it, how they sought to perfect it, how they sought to make it personal to them. And I think about where those stories are and how do we access them, because photographers have documented them. So it's a matter of us being open to the fact that they exist and going after those stories.
Thank you three so much. That was really wonderful. We now have time for just a few questions, so please be concise in your asking of them so that we can get to everyone who might have one. But please raise your hand, and Michelle will bring the microphone if we have any questions. Well, any questions? There we go. Everyone's shy until the first one.
How could you accept a submission, for example, or your Curator project, and how could you find the artists? I mean, it's,
Do you mean the archives that she's speaking of?
yes.
Like, how do you find them?
Yeah.
I think, so if we look at the McCormick and Calhoun, I think these works are there. It's that nobody has looked at them and tried to take them seriously. In that case, their archive was damaged by Hurricane Katrina. Supposedly they should have thrown it out, right? But they kept it and they use it. And so I think it is about, or being open to somebody who went on to do something else because he couldn't work in photography. Like, we have to be open to these other ways in which people engage as photographers. There are many different histories of photography, and we need to continue to be open to those in order to access the stories that they have to tell.
I love that there's like this beautiful metaphor in that image too of, there's like this beautiful color that's created, right? Like the water that they're damaged, but it also created like spaces of limitation become spaces of possibility.
Right.
And
an image that is, just a woman at a door becomes, like, what is that? Speaking of ghosts, we have ghosts in a lot of our images.
Yeah.
The ghost of the past, the little boy ghost, and here is another kind of ghostly image. It becomes something else because you're open to seeing it.
Thank you. And our next question?
I guess I'm curious about the Marion Post picture, and I want to ask, since I worked with her, but are we sure that it's a man who's reaching in to get his terrible pay and not a woman?
So with the other ones, I think it is a man with the series of the line. But I also think it's a man, if you look at it in person, it does look like a man. I don't think it's a woman. The hat and the kind of, you can see a little bit more of the person in the real one. I've looked at it, but I don't, and the hand, I don't think it's a woman, but it could be. Why do you ask? I think it's a man. Yeah.
I've always thought, actually, it could be a woman, and now I want to go back and look at the whole reel of Marcella Plantation pictures that she made.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to say is, I think I published it first in a little Marion Post wall-cut catalog, but it's really, I'm indebted to Susan Meiselas here, because I don't think I would have recognized this picture as so important in terms of pay had I not already seen Susan's carnival strippers in which money figures, and it's the first time I saw a photograph with money in it, in Susan's work, and then I thought, that's so weird to see money, but of course money is what motivates a lot of our work. And then I saw it here again, she's reaching, she can barely reach for the money. They're making it hard, and he's reaching for a cigarette because he's got a lot more to do and he's bored, et cetera. I always thought it was a woman. I want to
love it. We'll all have to look at it again.
But if nothing else, I'm glad that this conversation has made you want to revisit the work. Yes. Do we have any other questions? We have time for one more. Just in the back, Michelle. Thank you so much. And I think going off of the point, though, that it is important to know that all of these images come from really incredible series. Kara's, this is part of a large series, so is this. And of course, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you all for this really amazing panel. And I'm thinking still about something you, Makeda, said early on about approaching collecting as a way of responding to collections as they exist. And I think all three of you have spoken sort of about this from different directions, but I'm interested in hearing, when you think about approaching a project, thinking about how you stage these sort of responses in space and in your work as curators, what have you had to sort of unlearn about sort of received wisdom about the work that you do?
Yeah, so this project, I mean, I think that's interesting. It's, you know, how does the institution you work for have to unlearn? That's the real, you know, when I installed that Dawood Bey image, that was in a show where there were no labels, and it was inspired by Baldwin's own interest in music, so it was installed like a musical score. And that was seen as very out there, and who would understand that? So I think that we have ideas. I think that they're just conventions. And there's a way in which we have to have faith that our audience can get it, right? So I think it's about that too, having faith that our visitors will engage with these experiments and that they want to see something else as well. And I mean, today artists are doing that. They're putting works on the floor. They're doing all kinds of things. They're making photo sculptures, or they always have, but why don't we do some of that? Why don't we think of play in the space and how we install things?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question in terms of like space and actually unlearning things. I think I haven't shown those works yet, but I would love, I plan to. But one of the things that I've learned to unlearn is that there's not going to be one counter image. I think oftentimes in, grad school and I think teaching, there's always this search for a counter image that can be the counterbalance to some stereotype or sort of archetype, and the belief that you can find that one perfect thing, but there never is. And so I think like learning that there needs to be much more of a framework when exhibiting, and thinking more about the context and the way things are installed and what sort of tools that you need to bring people with you, and then still being like, this is never going to be complete, this work, I think is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and how you can sort of stage more expansive ways of reaching out, where it's not just about having an A and a B, and then that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I'm an anthropologist, so I don't have to unlearn as much about art history and what you're supposed to do in the conventions of, having photography as separate from prints or paintings or sculptures. I'm just like, these images are all, in conversation with one another. They're in different mediums, but let's put them together. But also, I think one of the things that institutions, that I've had to unlearn, that I think institutions need to unlearn, is not asking artists, especially from marginalized communities, to always respond to something, right? There's this expectation that the work is created as a response to the mainstream, and to talk about, representation and, this, like, we're still here trope, but rather like work that is emerging from within their communities and what's important to them, and kind of meeting those artists where they're at and bringing that work in on their terms and not on the institution's expectations of what the work should look like. And I think that's a tall order. There's a lot of work to be done there.
But a great note to end on for this. Thank the three of you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.